Hey there, and congratulations on moving forward and getting closer to home ownership. Now, as we move along the process of actually closing your property, we are at the disclosure, reviewing, and due diligence portion of the purchase process. Now, this process and this part of buying is very, very important because the property you're purchasing has a lot of things about it that could be different from any other property you've seen before. So we want to make sure that you know as much as possible about this property and that you're thoroughly reviewing all of these disclosures about the property, some of them specific to the property, some of them more general in nature. But it's very important. This is an extremely exciting topic, but it's extremely important that you take some time to sit down and go over all of these in their entirety and make sure you understand that everything that's in there. So we're going to start first and foremost with some of the more major ones. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're all important, but there are some more than others that we might be able to catch some potential red flags in more readily right off the bat. And these are things that might, more than others, have a more weighty impact on your decision as to whether or not you want to move forward in buying the property. So without further ado, we are going to start with the real estate transfer disclosure statement. Now, the majority of these disclosures that we're going to be going through are seller disclosures. They're disclosures that are coming from the seller. For all intents and purposes, that's who's providing these disclosures. Now, some of them are specifically completed and filled out by the homeowner. And that's important because, of course, who would know more about a property than the owner of the property, and especially if they are the owner-occupant or prior occupant, then who's going to know more about the property than somebody who's been living in it for a number of years? And that's entirely the point with these first two disclosures, is that these are going to disclose everything to you that a seller knows about their property. And they're very important. The transfer disclosure statement is a statutory disclosure, unless there's a few exemptions that allow a seller not to be required to complete this, such as if they never occupied the property, it might be a trust sale, or a few other exemptions. But for the most part, the majority of traditional sales, this is going to be a required document. Now, in this document, the seller is completing, to the best of their knowledge, everything they essentially know about the property. And one of the key terms we're going to be talking about here is material facts. So when we're discussing disclosures, we are looking for material facts. Now, a material fact is something that to the normal person, or to most people, and this isn't really so much a matter of opinion, just if you think in any way a fact would possibly change the desirability or the decision of somebody to move forward or not move forward with a purchase of something, whether it's real estate or whatever, then that is considered a material fact. For example, a paint drip on a living room floor might be considered a defect, but we're talking about a drop of paint on the floor, and you can probably scrub that off. Now, if we're talking about underneath that floor, maybe the seller just put those new floors down, and underneath the floor there's a crack in the foundation that we can't see, a cracked slab or a damaged raised foundation, then of course that could very well be something that would impact a potential buyer's decision as to whether or not to continue forward and actually purchase a property. So material facts are very important, and the entire point of disclosures is to make sure that you are presented with all material facts about the property before committing 100%, removing your contingencies, and deciding to actually consummate and go forward with the sale. So the transfer disclosure statement is one of two pretty extensive disclosures that ask the seller a number of questions about the property, and most of them are pretty straightforward yes or no questions. And if they answer yes to any of these, then they must provide an explanation to them down here. And if they don't, it's going to be an incomplete form, and we're going to have to get them to do that. But for a fully completed form, any yes answers are going to have an explanation down here. Now, if there's any questions or confusion about any of these disclosures or the information in this one, make sure you reach out to us. But everything here is pretty straightforward. Now, these forms are always being modified and updated through the years. Just understand that everything comes from experience. So in the very beginning, They might not realize that there's a common issue with the property, but it may become something that pops up more readily through the years, and you're going to start seeing forms updated to cover that. So understand none of this is perfect, but they are pretty thorough in the questions and explanations that they cover. So that's the real estate transfer disclosure statement. Now, if, for example, they mark something on here that they don't have, or they don't mark something that they do have, then that also is technically an incomplete form, and we're going to have to get them to comply with the correct completion of that form. But just understand that for the most part, at a glance, this is going to be one of the more important forms to review. I mean, some of it, like I said, if they complete something inaccurately, then we'll address that. But if we're going down here, for example, and do you know of any major flooding, drainage, or grading problems? Yes. And then the seller says, well, every time it rains, the backyard floods. Well, when you get this disclosure pack and you're running through these, you can first and foremost just run down this list. Look for the yes answers. If there's not a lot of yes answers or none at all, that's going to be a good sign for the most part. But if they're checking yes, then we're going to be wanting to look down into this description area and explaining what was going on there. So if they said, for example, let's say there's an encroachment that may affect your interest in the property. Now, encroachment is basically something maybe extending over a property line that should not be there. Now, that could be a shed, it could be part of a house, it could be a patio slab, or it could even be a tree. So if somebody, maybe if their tree is like a 100-year-old oak and it's hanging over the neighbor's property, maybe the next door neighbor is okay with that, but that's technically an encroachment, and they are going to technically want to disclose that because that could potentially be a liability for you down the road. But not all of these yes answers are going to be, created equal. So if they say, first and foremost, any homeowners association has authority on the subject property, of course, that's not going to be a bad thing per se. That's just going to be something that, of course, we're probably already aware of. Same thing with CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Most neighborhoods in San Diego County have CC&Rs. And of course, if you're buying a property in an HOA, then you're going to expect that the property has HOA authority over the property. So some of these are not going to be issues so much as just things to, of course, keep front of mind and be aware of. Now, again, this one's just more straightforward. Are they aware of any of this stuff? Now, once we get into the seller property questionnaire, we're going to move a little bit quicker now. But once we begin in the seller property questionnaire, this is going to go and ask them a lot of questions. Some of them might overlap the last ones, but this goes a little bit more in depth. Within the last 3 years, was there a death of an occupant on the property? So understand there's some things that have to be disclosed and some things that don't. So if maybe it was 5 years ago and somebody passed peacefully, that's technically not required by California law to be disclosed. Now, it asks them a number of different questions in a number of different ways. Some of these are going to overlap with other disclosures, not just the transfer disclosure statement, but other disclosures as well. For example, whether the property is affected by a nuisance, like an industrial use zone. Some of that stuff is also going to be covered and overlapped in a natural hazard disclosure statement. So if it's near an airport, or it might be covered by the I'm missing it there, but there's a number. I lost my train of thought there, but there's a number of things that will be overlapped multiple times. So that just creates redundancy for you, which is great because you're going to have multiple sources to analyze and make sure that you're making the best decision based on the facts that you have. Repairs and alterations. Here's another example again. Now you want to be going through and checking out what yes answers they have, but sometimes yes answers are not bad. Any alterations, modifications, replacements, improvements, remodeling, etc. They could check yes, and they could say, I completely remodeled the entire house. I completely painted the interior or the exterior. We got a brand new roof or whatever. It could also be, well, yeah, we had a flood, and we had to redo the entire kitchen because the plumbing pipe burst. So don't necessarily assume that any yes thing is a bad thing. Just understand that everything needs to be taken a look at in the proper context. you're going to want to, again, go through all of this stuff and make sure that, though, you understand everything that's being presented in here and determine for yourself if any of these are going to be issues for you. What's an issue for one person may not even so much as bat an eye, have another person batting their eye. So make sure you go through this, and if you have any questions about this, bring it up to us and let us know. Something important in here, if you are buying in a HOA community, condominium, or a common interest development, are there any pending or proposed dues increases, special assessments, rule changes, etc., that they are anticipating? Things like this could be potentially major decision points for you, because if you're already buying at the top of your price range, for example, then maybe they're talking about issuing a supplemental assessment for all the unit owners in a complex. Then that could potentially mean some additional money out of your pocket if they voted for something like that in the future. So most of the time that's not going to be the case, but it's important to keep in mind. And again, review this in its entirety. And as your agent, we cannot make the decision for you as to whether or not something is a big deal. So if there's something that you have a question or concern about, bring it up to us. Get outside advice if you like. We're going to, of course, advise you as far as our experience goes, but we cannot advise you on legal issues. So make sure that you address any concerns you have with us, and then if we don't answer it for you, we'll make sure that we can guide you to the correct source for further information. All right, residential earthquake hazards report. This is also completed by the seller. Obviously, they have the option for checking. They don't know about a property, but this is basically about the construction of the property and its potential implications were there to be a major earthquake. So you're also going to get a homeowner's earthquake safety guide in your disclosure packet as well, and this sort of accompanies that, so you can kind of correlate some of the descriptive terms in here with that guide. Again, review it. If you have any questions or concerns, let us know. On the next one, natural hazard disclosure statement. Now, natural hazard disclosure statement accompanies the natural hazard disclosures. So this is a statement that you're going to find in there in your actual NHD. Now, the NHD packet, natural hazard disclosures packet, is provided by a third party. So understand this. This is no longer the seller completing it themselves. The seller is most likely not a geologist or a scientist or anybody who knows anything about most of the things that natural hazards are going to be impacted by. So it's very important that you take a look at that, all the third-party disclosures in there. And it's going to be a very complete package explaining things such as whether or not you're in an extremely high fire hazard area, or if you're in a liquefaction zone, or if you are sitting on a potential fault line, or an area of potential flooding, or if you're in a dam inundation zone, or any of that stuff. It's also going to have a lot more information about whether or not you're maybe located next to or a current or past hazardous ordnance disposal area, or next to military bases, or other things that may impact the desirability or use of your property. Again, very important that you take a complete in-depth look at that, especially considering some of the items in there might affect more than just your opinion of the property, but also could impact the amount of money that the property is going to cost you on a monthly basis. For example, if it is located in a FEMA flood zone, then there is the majority of the time, unless the property is exempt from that flood zone, sometimes there's rare occasions it is, but for the most part, if it's in a flood zone, you are probably going to be required by your lender to obtain flood insurance. And that, of course, is going to come at an additional premium per month. So little things like that are very important to keep an eye out for. Of course, your agent is reviewing this information as well to be on the lookout for any potential red flags. But again, it's your responsibility as the buyer to make sure that you're reviewing this and bringing up any concerns that you have before moving forward on the property. Next one, mold advisory. Now, this is just an advisory, does not state anything specific about the property or anything completed by the seller. It is just an advisory to you that if you have any concerns about mold, that you have a mold test done. Of course, now, if we go into a property and there's some funky smells and past water damage and things of that nature, that might be something you want to look at. Now, if this is a new built house, brand new construction, of course, there could be mold in there, but for the most part, that's probably down the list of concerns. So just something else to keep in mind. Lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards disclosure. Now, this is for properties built prior to 1978. After 1978, they outlawed the use of lead in paint. So this is going to apply to some properties and not to others. So it's important that you take a look at it. And just be aware that if you have a property built prior to 1978, whether or not the seller acknowledges or suggests that they have knowledge of lead-based paint, I would advise, unless the property was burnt down and then rebuilt again since then, just go in with the assumption that there is probably lead paint somewhere in the house. Whether or not it's got 5 coats of paint on top of it, just understand that if you were to do any sanding or repainting of areas, that you would probably have to comply by certain EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, renovation, repair, and painting rules. Okay. Next one. Now, this is just an example of a preliminary title report. Now, the purpose of the preliminary title report is to kind of give you an overview of anything that's known about the property on title. So ultimately, this is really the title insurance company's report on the title. And they're kind of showing you, okay, this is what we got on the title, and with the exception of a few certain things that obviously need to be paid off or addressed, we are open to issuing a title insurance policy on the property. Now, also on this report, for the most part, you're going to see things on here. You're first and foremost going to see a legal description of the property. And this doesn't really look like your 123 Main Street address, but this is a legal description of the property, one of the few places you're ever going to see this. But it's making sure that they are talking about the exact same property parcel number that you are purchasing. And in this, it's going to reflect prior and current property taxes in the property. It's going to talk about easements. This is something very important to keep in mind. If you're purchasing a property and there's an easement, now these aren't, most of the time you're going to have some easements on a property, such as this for utilities, ingress and egress of pipelines, drainage, and other public utilities. This is completely normal to have an easement. You know, if you have cable, or if you have a phone line, or electricity, or of course sewer service, or anything that is provided by an exterior utility provider, they're going to need access to your property on occasion. So it's important that, of course, there are some easements that give them a legal right to access parts of your property for specific purposes. Now, if there are easements on here, maybe you're buying a piece of farmland and there's a lot behind you and you don't know what is going on with it, but you notice there's a little dirt road that goes back there and you can't see any other way to access it. Understand that if there is an easement on there and maybe that guy has a legal right to cross over your property to access that land, that's of course a material fact now, isn't it? So we want to make sure that we're reviewing this for easements and anything out of the ordinary, keeping that in mind, because if somebody has to cross your property to get to their property and they have a legal right to do so, then chances are you're going to want to know about that and take that into consideration, determining whether or not you're going to move forward with this purchase. Other things on here as well are going to be, it's going to list your CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Now, nearly most communities and neighborhoods have some sort of CC&Rs attached to them. But here you can go and you can actually click on these and it will take you to a new page with a photocopy of those documents. So you can actually sit down and review those actual documents and read the actual covenants, conditions, and restrictions that affect your property. Most of the time it's things such as appearance and how far away from the street properties can be built, and property lines and maintenance, and it's simple things that just more or less protect your value of the property and the aesthetics of a certain neighborhood. Moving on to the next one. Anyway, make sure you review the prelim title report. Your agent's, of course, again, going to be reviewing this as well, but make sure you take a look at that, and if you have any questions, bring that up to your agent. Next one, seller's affidavit of non-foreign status. Now, this is probably confusing, like, why do you really care if a seller is foreign or not? Well, it's just because there are certain rules and withholding laws that apply to if it's a foreign seller and if they're profiting on the property. So ultimately, the bottom line is this is going to be handled by escrow. Okay, your qualified substitute, title or escrow, is going to satisfy your requirement here. But if it wasn't for that, technically, legally, as a buyer, it's your responsibility to withhold a certain percentage of the sales price in the case that the seller is foreign. And kind of funky, but again, it's just a required disclosure. Don't worry about it if you're working with a title and escrow company, because they are the qualified substitute. But again, it is required that you acknowledge and sign that. But also, again, just pay attention that you're not actually having that liability because it's title or escrow substituting that. Next one, statewide buyer and seller advisory. This is a fun 12-page document. Take a look at it, review it in its entirety. A lot of general disclosures here, talking about your responsibilities as a buyer, seller's responsibilities as a seller, and then just other general topics about buying a property, from everything from water systems, septic systems, water intrusion, mold, environmental hazards, a lot of the stuff we've already gone over, building permits, views, etc. These are important things. I know it's kind of blah, probably 80% of it's not going to apply to you. Maybe a lot more than that will not apply to you. However, you are buying a property for probably hundreds of thousands, maybe more, of dollars, and it's very important that you take a little bit of time to review these sort of things. If there's anything on here that draws your attention to something that you weren't aware of that maybe you want to investigate further, that's important to bring up with your agent. So make sure you review this. Make sure you bring up any questions to your agent, and just make sure you understand everything in there. Next one, market conditions advisory. Now, this is kind of, the title kind of says it all. It's letting you know that market conditions are prone to vary. So it's your responsibility also to just understand that real estate prices go up and down. There's real estate cycles. And in general, there's no guarantee that prices will continue to go up or prices are going to maintain stable or anything like that. Of course, talk to your agent and they're going to give you the best professional opinion and advice based on current market conditions, but understand that we have no control over the market and it is your responsibility to understand that. And the next one is the notice of your supplemental property tax bill. Now, you're also going to be receiving a video on this that we've put together for you, but understand that the supplemental property tax bill is a one-time thing. Sometimes it's split into two payments, but it's a one-time thing once you buy a property or if you redevelop a property, if you add on to a property or build on vacant land. But for the most part, it's most commonly brought up when you actually buy a property. This is a one-time tax that covers the difference in the assessed value of your property when you're buying it, from the previous owner, and then when you actually own the property, the price you actually paid for that property, and it calculates a fee that you have to pay separate from your normal principal and interest, taxes and insurance, monthly payment to your lender. This needs to be paid separate from that. So watch the video we send you regarding this, and if you have any questions about this, let us know, but we explain it pretty well in that video as well. So anyway, that's a wrap for the primary disclosures that you should be looking for as a buyer. Now, there might be a few additional ones. Sometimes there is specific ones to a specific title or escrow or real estate company that a seller might be obligated to provide because the agent they're working with has to disclose a certain thing. But for the most part, these are some of the biggest ones that you need to be aware of. And if you have any questions about any of these, of course, as always, let us know. Talk to your agent, and we will make sure we get your questions answered for you.